Good afternoon. We are on Sunday, the 26th of September 2021. It is my spiritual daughter's birthday today in Australia, the 26th of September. And she's expecting to hear more of this book. She's listened to one or two, but she hasn't got them all over there. So I'm going to do chapter 6. And then go back to the beginning and go live and record whatever time I'll spend live, I don't know. Hopefully maybe to get a few chapters from the beginning done for those who might not find them. But that's the plan. So for now, this is a biography by Angela Canning. It costs £8.99 from WW Olympia Publishers, ISBN 978-1788-30-9660, and it is about a couple who were on the stage in the West End, and they began caring for wildlife after finding a pigeon hit by a taxi in front of their eyes in the Strand. So they began rescuing wildlife. For 30 years they did it in Newbury, Berkshire, and they had a hospital. It's a wonderful read, it's delightful. And I do have the name of the charity. It's going to a wildlife charity. But I have to read one of Angela's emails. She goes to my church, so I've got permission to read this. And she knew the people, so that makes it even more interesting. It's a wonderful story. Obviously, I know it now. So God bless you all, and thank you for listening. So we're on chapter 6 of this book. It's a true story. Everything in it is true. Chapter 6. 1968. The patients at the Wildlife Hospital took to their aviary as ducks had taken to the pond. Rooks, crows, magpies and pigeons, to name a few, poured in during April and May, and amongst them was a nest of blackbirds, whose beautiful song at dawn was a treat to hear. The earthen floor of the aviary around which they all pottered before learning to fly. It served as a ready exercise and acclimatization before returning to the great world outside. A gentle song thrush with a wounded leg was amongst them, and we called her Laura. We loved to watch with her beautiful spotted breast ranging from cream to buttermilk. She would hop along the ground listening attentively, her head cocked to one side. Then quick and lightning would stab at the earth and pull up a worm. Sometimes she discovered a snail amongst the foliage, which she would thrash against a stone, retrieving the contents from the broken shell. As soon as she recovered from her injury, we released her. At the weekend came 2 orphaned tawny owls brought by a young boy. Their nest was destroyed. He told us, "I cannot keep them because I have to go back to boarding school. You will take care of Woo and Wol for me, will you not?" His little face looked so dejected that I said reassuringly, "Of course, son. Now you go back to school, and you will have no need to worry at all." We put Woo and Wol, hardly a month old, into a roosting box, and they nestled together on their perch, blinking at their new surroundings. When Brian called upon us one day, owls and kestrels watched suspiciously from the trees in the aviary. Cheeky magpies and jackdaws sprang amongst the foliage, while The host of fledglings trilled from the boxes in the end partition. He talked to them animatedly, seeming satisfied with handiwork. Suddenly we heard him calling, "Look!" And when we went to where he was standing, a thrush was returning with worms and pushing them through the netting into tiny gaping mouths, feeding all and sundry. "That must be Laura," we exclaimed, fulfilling her mother instincts. We had seen it all before. A fledgling blackbird that we had reared only just able to peck itself had been feeding the 3 others in that same aviary. Meanwhile, Woo and Woll were thriving well, growing day by day. It was always heartening to observe Patience surviving to maturity, and we wished it for these 2 more than any other, as they were pets of the young boy. Spring turned into summer, when running a wildlife hospital never ceased to be without its surprises. We answered the doorbell at 7 one evening, and there stood a lady clutching a heron. "I have brought it all the way from Scotland." "Scotland?" "I was returning from holiday and found it on the Clyde, covered in oil." "Well, it is great to know that there are caring people about like you," we answered, and took it from her. Thank goodness, it had obviously not swallowed too much oil, or it would never have survived the journey, and there was hope of saving it. Swiftly we administered vitamins through a funnel with a long tube obtained from the vets, knowing it would be dehydrated. Our next task was to set about removing the clinging black grease, first and foremost from the parts which it would try to preen. We worked and worked on its plumage, rubbing swarfiga into wings and breast and immersing it up after each stage in washing up liquid and hot water. Finally, we rubbed liquid paraffin into its feathers to restore their natural oils. Next, we cleaned its long legs and razor-sharp beak, nature's weapon to spear its prey while standing in the river. In normal circumstances, we would never have been able to do this. In the wild, if you do not approach a heron delicately and as quick as lightning grab its neck, it will slash you or even blind you. But Archie was weak and had not the will to protect himself. After several days, he began to recover his dignity again. And in the typical way of fish eating, Birds took a herring which we threw to him, seizing it in the centre of it, body lifting his head and turning it round to eat it, head first, so that he would not choke. One day I went into his cage and startled him. Archie regurgitated his food whole onto the ground, giving me as much of a surprise as he had had. We learned so much simply from watching wildlife close at hand. This was the characteristic of herons. I find this bit in the story interesting because I married a heron, so there's no way I would behave like the heron described here because I'm only a heron by marriage. But they're like that. It was time to take our usual stroll with Eno along the canal. We had not gone far when an Alsatian pup came bounding up to us asking for fuss, and we stopped. His mistress was following behind with a little girl and a baby in a buggy. We patted the puppy's light brown head, enhanced by a black V, and he placed his paw in my hand. How do you do? What is your name then? I asked. That's Rusty, volunteered the little girl. And how old is he? 12 weeks, answered her mother. But I'm afraid we cannot keep him any longer. He's jealous of the new baby. You see, it's terrible. Oh dear. And have you found another home for him? She shook her head. We've asked everywhere, but it's not easy homing a dog that has a temperament. He has one more week or else, she added worriedly. I looked at Rusty's pleading eyes, begging for his life. Give us your telephone number, I said. If we hear of anybody, we will let you know. That night, for some reason, I could not get that dog out of my mind. I tossed and turned until Yvonne woke up. Whatever is the matter? That pup. His pleading expression keeps coming back to me. But what can we do about it? We could have 2 dogs, could we not? She sat up, incredulous. A Pekingese and an Alsatian? I ignored the remark. Did you not think he was a lovely dog? He was gorgeous. What is wrong then? I thought someone once spoke about going from the sublime to the ridiculous. We collected Rusty the next day and brought him home. There didn't seem to be any problem with him getting on with a Pekingese. They both took to each other like long-lost pals, chasing around the house and the garden, being severely admonished if they disturbed the wildlife, and afterwards would lie down exhausted together in Rusty's dog bed. Although Eno was the senior by 2 years, it was he who decided when they had had enough rest. He'd lick Rusty impetuously round his face, and having incited him to start playing again, put his head inside his mouth. Each evening, as soon as the word walk was mentioned and collars and leads were fastened on, Eno would pick up Rusty's lead and pull him out of the door. Watching the two was always a comedy, and one day we had an idea. To earn some extra money, we put an advert in the Newbury Weekly News. Dog owners, why not join in the fun and bring your pet to dog training classes every Monday evening, 7:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. at St. Nicholas Church Hall, West Mills, Newbury, 2 and 6 shillings per session. For this, we always provided a free cup of tea, and people turned up with dogs of all shapes and sizes. There were mongrels, a retriever, there was a digger, a red setter, who constantly dug up his master's vegetable bed. Quite uncontrollable, he told us. A lady brought along Josephine, a black cocker spaniel, who was quiet and quite the opposite. 2 Jack Russells arrived who frolicked and tumbled over one another. A dachshund stood snootily ignoring the rest. There were 3 Labradors and a Doberman, who turned out to be as gentle as he looked fierce. Eno and Rusty regarded all these intruders with surprise and curiosity, thinking it a wonderful opportunity to have a game and nose their newfound friends in delight. Right now, I called, clapping my hands to get attention above all the commotion, when all were assembled in the hall. Let us begin with some obedience training. The first exercise was spent teaching the dogs to halt and then return to their owners. The second, encouraging them to guard a basket or their owner's gloves at the door of a shop. 2 chairs placed apart served the purpose. Both exercises created a great deal of amusement. Most of the dogs spent their time doing exactly the opposite. But the star of the show was Josephine. She performed all her duties to perfection. The next week we played at scenting. Each owner had been asked to bring along his pet's toy. All the dogs were then shut outside in the passage, and the toys were placed together in the centre of the room. And they were all let in together. Digger bounded for his spotted ball called Measles, while a Jack Russell charged in and out of his legs and sent him sprawling. A Labrador had hold of one end of a slipper and the retriever the other, both tugging, barking and squealing. Rusty seized a one-eared teddy which did not belong to him and charged off with it, with Eno at his heels, while a mongrel sat with a pink rabbit in his mouth, growling at Josephine and daring her to touch it. They were happy, and we were happy, but there is a saying that happiness is a fleeting thing. In the midst of it all, suddenly misfortune struck, and the reason was one that no one would have expected. Ever since we had left London, I had felt my body was beginning to suffer a sex change. I had ignored it for years, but its progression suddenly developed beyond control, and I knew I had to succumb to it. I decided to dress as a woman and change my name from Louis to Louise VENESS, while Yvonne and I agreed that we would become known as the VENESS sisters. In those days this condition was scorned by the medical association, and I received no help whatsoever. It was also scorned by St. Nicholas's Church, where I was the verger. The position was always held by a man, and we were given notice. As we sat devastated by the canal on that sad summer's evening, its grand edifice loomed majestically over the water, and the mill stood silently in the glow of the setting sun. The 40-foot launch, limply stoked, was returning through the lock, and John waved from the helm as he passed, ferrying a crowd of holiday-makers back home. He had not heard the news. We watched the swallows and martins circling and sweeping over the water after insects. Within a month, they too would be returning to a warmer land, and the summer would be over. Without the Wildlife Hospital, who would fare for their young born late in the year, the fledglings, too immature to fly across the mammoth seas to South Africa, and left behind to face the cruelty of winter? How could we desert them? The words of Kipling suddenly ran through my mind. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on, when there is nothing in you except the will, which say to them, hold on, yours is the earth and everything that is in it. Yvonne continued, well, is that not us? I asked. I suppose so. We have won before, and we will win again, I vowed. And as always, we did. The end of chapter 6. So chapter 7 will be next, done separately, and that will be covering 1968 to 1969, because this is a real story about real people. They really did have a hospital in Newbury, Berkshire, and looking after wild creatures, because it was the first of its kind in England. They never had those sort of places in those days. So we'll be recording that another time. God bless you all, and thank you for listening. I'll put about the book in the description of what's the contents.